Hey pushers, Dr. Kilo here, continuing our discussion of Chapter 35 and the beginnings of the Cold War in America. Today we're going to talk about Truman and his winning of the 1940 election, and we're also going to talk about the beginnings, the foundations of the economic boom of the 1950s. Before we get to all that, let's talk a little bit about what happens after the war. When the war ends, Americans are very much afraid that they're going back into a Great Depression that we had before the war, and that those fears were supported by the idea that we had a bit of a recession in 1946. We had a recession because we closed all the factories down that had been producing war materials. And when they closed all the factories down, they laid off workers. The laid off workers actually helped create a recession in 1946. So Americans were kind of terrified by that. We also had a lot of strikes sweeping the country because during the war, workers were not allowed to go on strike. Wages were controlled by the federal government. And when all that ends, workers said, we want some money now. So how did Congress deal with that? They passed what's called the Taft-Hartley Act, which limited the power of workers to unionize in America. It kind of blows my mind that we talked about the trickle-down theory of the 1920s, where Republicans were saying, don't worry, all the money we're giving to the rich people will trickle down to you. And then in the 1940s, when they started saying, hey, can we get some of that money? Congress actually passed laws to help prevent them from demanding that money. So there you go. Unions at this time were also trying to expand. This is the height of unions in America in the 1950s. And they're expanding into the South, but their ability to expand in the South was hampered by the fact that white workers did not want to work with black workers. Go figure. Once again, racism gets in the way of workers getting their rights. But that happens. All right, so they passed the Employment Act in 1946 to help promote the government's encouraging people to get jobs and help them get jobs. They passed the GI Bill. This is probably the most important thing they did at this time period. What they did was they gave every veteran of the war basically free college tuition and loans for housing. So guaranteed loans for housing. So this was huge. And think about that. This is American taxpayers giving money to people for education and housing. And this helps explode our economy, helps get our economy going. It primes the pump. Some people today would call this democratic socialism. It's what Bernie Sanders talks about all the time. And we did it at the end of the war for our veterans. And we continue to do it today. I myself went to college in the 1990s on the GI Bill when I was in the Army. So there you go. Thank you very much to American taxpayers. I appreciate it. So here's an example after the war, the government providing housing. These are trailers for people. It's almost like a FEMA park after a hurricane or something like that. But look at the way these folks are dressed. I mean, these folks are taking their kids and their dog for a walk. They're wearing suits and trench coats and dresses. This lady's wearing a dress, top hat, going to work. They may be poor at the moment, but they don't, they're still dressing nice. They're still looking like they want to dress nice. So the election of 48, this is kind of cool. So in 1946, Congress was controlled by the Republicans. And this makes sense when you think about it. Democrats had controlled the White House for 16 years at this point. That's a long time for any party to control the White House. And there was a movement to the right at this time. So people are kind of voting for Republicans. In 46, the Republicans take over Congress, and they are simply biding their time, waiting for the election in 48 so they can take back the White House and control the whole government. So Democrats in 1948, they're going to go with Truman because, hey, he's their candidate. He's the president. How do you not go along with the president? It'd be crazy not to do that. So they nominate Truman. Truman, though, is not actually popular in all parts of the country. In 1947, he desegregated the military, right? Got rid of segregation so that we don't have white units and black units. We have integrated units. The South did not appreciate that. The South were Democrats. Truman's a Democrat. But the Southern Democrats were very angry at Truman for making civil rights an issue, right? So they decide they're going to split from the Democratic Party and vote for their own candidate. We call Southerners that did this Dixiecrats. Democrats, Dixiecrats. And they end up supporting a guy named Strom Thurmond. Oh my God, what a horrible person. So Strom Thurmond his platform is all segregation, right? It's racism. He runs on a platform of racism. All right, of course, he loses the election, and we find out when he dies in like 2005. He died. He's like the oldest person to ever serve in the Senate. He was a senator for 50 years. When he dies, it's discovered that he had a child with his maid at the time who was African American. He had a love child. His platform was segregation, yet he's having children with his maid, right? So you take what you can from that. It's kind of crazy. So it looks like in 1948, the Democrats are going to lose the election because they have like 3 Democrats running against 1 Republican. And as you remember from 1912, when you have multiple Republicans running in that year, the Democrat wins because the Republican vote was split. They think the same thing's going to happen here in 48. Truman looks like he's a goner. He goes on he goes on a nationwide tour giving what they call "Give 'em Hell Harry" speeches, where he talks about labor's being hurt by Republicans, how Republicans, since they controlled the Congress in 1946, hadn't done anything, and that was true. They hadn't done anything. They're waiting for a Republican president so they can get their legislation passed. Why pass legislation you know is going to get vetoed? It makes no sense. So they do nothing. But Truman goes around and exploits that in his campaign speeches, and the American people eat it up. They agree with him. Right? So his platform against civil rights, improving labor benefits, and health insurance, good cause. And so the Chicago Tribune, the night of the election, prints its papers saying Dewey defeats Truman. They'd stopped doing polling back in August of that year, thinking Dewey had a huge lead. There's no way Truman's going to win this election. But guess what? All right. So once again, I can't emphasize this enough. The South voted for a candidate whose complete platform was based on racism. Can't miss that enough. This is the beginning of America swapping places for the parties. We know that the Republicans back in the 1860s, they were the ones that freed the slaves. And people often wondered, well, how did they become the party of older white people today? And Democrats today are the ones that are seen as the multi-ethnic party, whereas back in the 1860s, they were the slaveholders. Well, that change begins to happen under Truman, really, where Truman starts to make civil rights his issue. And the Democratic members of the South don't like that, so they start splitting off, forming their own parties, and we begin to see that swap. That swap doesn't really complete itself until the 1970s with Nixon, but we'll get there later. All right, so what's going on here? So Truman's plan. Internationally, he has this thing called the Point Four plan, where he begins to give foreign aid to countries so that they don't turn to communism. It's kind of like what we did in Europe with the Marshall Plan, but we're doing it all around the world. It's a good idea. It worked. It helps. America's producing all this stuff in the 1950s through our industry, but you need to have someone to sell to. So we kind of got all these countries around the world back on their feet so they could buy our stuff. It ends up helping us. People think foreign aid is always a waste of money. It's not always a waste of money. Sometimes it comes back to us, which in this case, that's what happened. All right. So his program overall is called the Fair Deal. You might remember that Theodore Roosevelt had the Square Deal. Franklin Roosevelt had a New Deal. Now here we got Truman ripping it all off with his Fair Deal. But look at this, very democratic platform, what the Democrats used to believe in anyway, not anymore, but they used to. Improved housing, full employment, national health insurance, still don't have it. Higher minimum wages, better farm prices supports, that's basically subsidies for farmers. New government programs to help farmers and put people back to work and produce electricity. TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. You might remember that from the Great Depression and the New Deal. And extension of Social Security. Okay, this is very much the Democratic platform that we used to have, but not so much anymore. Even though Democrats control the Congress, they don't get everything they want because the Republicans, there's enough of them where they're able to, in the Senate, to kill a lot of this stuff. But he does manage to get minimum wage increased. He manages to get Housing Act passed in '49. And he gets Social Security expanded for old people. So there you go. There's some victories. But the economic boom is just getting started in the 50s. The 50s is known as the Age of Affluence because America becomes rich in the 1950s. Our industries explode. We are basically the one economy left standing after World War II. And because we have that advantage over every other country, we exploit it and we become, like the world's Amazon, the world's Amazon, right? We are just producing for the world. We're shipping stuff all over the world. We're making a fortune. So as a result of this, national income nearly doubles in the 1950s. Again, our salaries are going up. You're going to see later, there's a graph that shows, they're going up, but eventually that doesn't happen forever. People are moving to suburbs. They're buying houses. They're making families. Again, the baby boom is coming in. We are just exploding. Our economy is doing great. And again, this isn't like the 1920s or the 1980s where economy is based on credit. This is not that. This is actual wealth that is trickling down to everybody. We are making money in the 1950s. It's a good time to be an American, which is why baby boomers today are saying, make America great again. What they mean is go back to the 50s, which ain't going to happen, but whatever. So some of this stuff's misleading because they talk about 50s to 70s. We'll get into the 60s and 70s later. The 50s is not exact. It's the beginning of that time period, but it's not exactly like the other decades. So we're going to stick to the 50s here. Again, we are kind of making up for the suffering of the 30s. This is the baby boom generation. Thomas Friedman, an author from The World is Flat, he calls these guys the grasshopper generation because they're the ones that benefited from this economic boom. They're the ones that consumed the world's resources. They're the ones that got pensions and did all this great stuff. They lived off of the boom years of America. They're the ones today trying to keep us from getting our benefits, though, because they just want to maintain what they have and screw everybody else, basically. This is misleading. Women in the 50s, I don't think they really reaped the rewards of this time period. I'm sure there were more women in the workforce at this time period, but still, you don't really see women getting into the workforce until the 1970s. All right, so at this time period, after World War II, women are told, thank you for your work in the factories during the war, but now it's time for you to go home, make babies, go back to being a traditional woman. And so women did that. It was pretty much a miserable life for a lot of folks. All you are is making babies during the 1950s. Until a woman writes a book called The Feminine Mystique that begins the movement that climaxes in the 1970s with the Equal Rights Amendment. That doesn't happen until the end of the 50s, but so most of the 50s, women are simply working back at home and being asked to just be homemakers. That's it. Go back to your traditional role as a woman. So what helps propel this economic growth of the 50s? Part of it is defense spending. We just spend a ton of money on our military and other militaries and producing weapons for the world. That's pretty much where we make our money. And that kind of primes the pump for the rest of our economy. Okay. Here's defense spending. This is, you can see defense spending is going up. This shows the percentage of the federal budget. Even though it's high here, it's high down here too, but because the economy is growing so much and our budget's growing so much, the numbers actually for the defense go down. So this is kind of misleading where you see the percent of the GDP. Our defense spending is going up. Today it's about almost $800 billion a year, which is more than the next 10 or 12 countries combined. So we're still producing a lot of weapons. Again, so military budget financed much scientific research and development. So it's called R&D. Taxpayer money financed research and development that private corporations then use to make profits. Again, some of us would call that corporate socialism, but that's how it worked back then, and it still works that way today. We are using our global influence to get cheap energy, mostly in the form of oil. We are doubling our oil consumption. This is basically where we are burning down the environment right now. That we're seeing the effects of this today. But 1950s, nobody cared. Gas was cheap. We bought cars that sucked gas, a lot and put out lots of fumes. We didn't care. Life was good in the 50s. Okay, so productivity increased 3% a year during the 1950s. I'm going to show you a graph in a second that's kind of important to that. Educational level of the workforce expands. Thank you, GI Bill and other things. We just had a better schools, better everything in the 50s. Again, people want to make America great. They mean the 1950s. You really can't go back to that, but we try. Okay, people are still shifting from agriculture to other things. Beginning of a white-collar economy in the 1950s, where people work behind a desk rather than working with their hands. That's kind of getting started. This is the graph I want to show you. So this is productivity, the dark blue line, and this is compensation, the money people are making for their productivity. You can see that they're both going up, as it should, during the 1950s and 60s. When we hit 1970s, though, we see a split where productivity goes up and hourly compensation does not. This in between here, that's profit that's going to the wealthy people. These folks aren't getting it anymore. It's just going to the wealthy people. That ain't right, and that's what we've got still today. We call this, by the way, the beginning of neoliberalism. All right, both Republicans and Democrats do this. Basically, it's an economic system where these people who produce all the goods get screwed out of all this money, and this money goes to the people who are sitting on their butts doing nothing. All right, and that's kind of what we have going on today. Picture of a farmer. So again, mechanization. Look at what we were able to do. Each farmer is able to feed 50 people compared to 15 in the 1940s. Right? We are just, I cannot say this enough, we are exploding as an economy. Things are getting great. People are, farmers are only making up 2% of the workforce at the time. Again, that's a huge reduction, but we don't need them because we've got mechanized agriculture going on at the time. Okay, and that's where I'm going to leave it off for today. We'll come back to people, where they're moving to, suburbs and all that stuff. We'll do that in the next episode for the end of this chapter. But that's where I'm going to leave off. I will see you guys again a little bit later. Take care.